I am Locutus.
Picture a Hollywood soundstage in the mid-1980s, littered with recycled props from a canceled science fiction revival, a filing cabinet full of decade-old scripts nobody remembered to throw away, and a cast of actors who had absolutely no idea they were about to build one of the most beloved franchises in television history. That was the reality behind Star Trek, The Next Generation, before a single frame ever aired. What looked, on screen, like a confident, gleaming vision of the future was, behind the cameras, a fragile experiment held together by compromise, recycled parts, and sheer stubbornness. When The Next Generation premiered in the fall of 1987, it inherited a franchise that many industry insiders assumed was already dead. 20 years after the original series went off the air, Paramount was betting a new syndicated show could resurrect Gene Roddenberry's universe for a new generation of viewers. This time led by a bald, classically trained Shakespearean actor few Americans had ever heard of. Patrick Stewart's Captain Jean-Luc Picard would eventually anchor 7 seasons and 178 episodes, launch 4 feature films, and inspire spin-offs that are still being produced decades later. But almost nothing about how that happened went according to plan. Behind Stewart stood a cast that would become just as iconic. Jonathan Frakes as the swaggering First Officer Riker, Brent Spiner as the android Data, forever chasing an understanding of humanity he could never quite grasp. LeVar Burton as Chief Engineer Geordi LaForge, Marina Sirtis as Ship's Counselor Deanna Troi, Michael Dorn as the fiercely loyal Klingon Officer Worf, and Gates McFadden as Dr. Beverly Crusher. Together, they built something that didn't just continue a franchise. It completely rewrote what a science fiction television show could be. But the clean, confident final product hides a production history full of near disasters, backstage power struggles, and decisions made under pressure that could have sunk the entire enterprise. Pun very much intended. Here are 15 facts about The Next Generation that even devoted fans often don't know. Stick around for the very last one. It's the story of an actress who refused to stay quiet and ended up changing the show for the better. Gene Roddenberry had a specific image in mind for the next captain of the Enterprise. Someone with obvious physical command, a swagger reminiscent of William Shatner's Kirk. A quiet, bald British stage actor best known for Shakespeare was about as far from that picture as you could get. When Patrick Stewart first read for the role, Roddenberry reportedly wasn't impressed and considered the casting closed almost as soon as it opened. But other executives at Paramount weren't ready to let the idea go. As a compromise, Stewart was asked to attend a final audition wearing a hairpiece, an attempt to soften his look into something closer to Roddenberry's original vision. He wore it through one read-through. Then the room asked to see him without it. What happened next reportedly settled the matter almost instantly. Network executives were far more captivated by Stewart's natural presence than by the toupee, and the decision was made to cast him as himself, bald head and all. Roddenberry stayed unconvinced for a while longer, and when the casting became public, a wave of fan letters flooded the studio insisting the show was doomed before it even started. It wasn't. Stewart's commanding, Shakespearean gravity became one of the defining traits of the entire series, and the hairpiece never got another outing. It's almost impossible to imagine the bridge of the Enterprise without Worf standing near tactical, arms crossed, radiating quiet menace. Yet when Roddenberry first drafted the show's creative Bible, he deliberately excluded familiar alien races from the original series altogether. No Vulcans, no Romulans, and no Klingon. The idea was to build something new from the ground up. As production got closer to actually shooting, Roddenberry reconsidered. A Klingon wearing a Starfleet uniform sent an unmistakable message. The old enemy had become an ally, and an entire century of political history had shifted since the days of Kirk and Spock. The character was added so late in the process that the bridge set had already been fully constructed with assigned stations for every other character. There was no console designed for Worf, which is part of the reason he spends much of the first season simply standing near the back of the bridge, drifting between positions rather than sitting at a dedicated post. Michael Dorn won the role after an audition where he reportedly stayed almost entirely in character, saying little, but projecting the stillness of someone who had genuinely lived through war. Roddenberry expanded the part on the spot. When Denise Crosby, who played Security Chief Tasha, decided to leave partway through Season 1, Worf inherited her role's responsibilities and finally got a permanent function on the crew. From a last-minute addition with nowhere to sit, Michael Dorn would go on to appear in more Star Trek episodes and films than any other actor in franchise history. Long before The Next Generation existed, Paramount had been developing a completely different Star Trek revival in the late 1970s, a project known internally as Phase 2. It got remarkably far. Sets were built, a creative Bible was written, and full scripts were drafted for a new television series. Then, at the last minute, the studio pivoted and turned the project into a feature film instead, Star Trek, the motion picture. The Phase 2 scripts were shelved, but they were never destroyed. When The Next Generation launched almost a decade later, producers quietly returned to that old filing cabinet. The clearest example came during the show's second season. A writer's strike had frozen new script development, and the production desperately needed a premiere episode on a tight schedule. Buried in the Phase 2 archive was a story originally built around a female officer becoming mysteriously pregnant by an alien entity. The concept was reworked with Counselor Troy in the lead role, and the resulting episode, The Child, opened Season 2. Other Phase 2 concepts were mined in similar ways throughout the show's run, proving that sometimes the fastest way forward is to look backward. Producing a weekly science fiction series on a television budget meant the show had to get resourceful fast. Rather than build everything from scratch, The Next Generation leaned heavily on props, models, and set pieces recycled from the original series and the early feature films. The transporter room is the most visible example. The circular pads Kirk and Spock once stood on in the 1960s were removed, flipped upside down, and reinstalled in the ceiling of the new transporter set as glowing light fixtures. Those same components had already appeared in multiple feature films before landing on The Next Generation, and they would continue their journey into later series as well. The show that presented itself as a bold vision of the future was, quite literally, built out of leftover pieces of the past. Ask any fan to hum the opening theme of The Next Generation, and they'll get it right instantly. What most don't realize is that the piece isn't a single original composition written for the series. The opening fanfare is lifted directly from Alexander Courage's theme for the original 1960 series, while the sweeping march that follows was composed by Jerry Goldsmith for Star Trek, the motion picture back in 1979. There actually was a brand new theme written specifically for The Next Generation by series composer Dennis McCarthy, fully completed and ready to use. At the last moment, producers chose to set it aside in favor of stitching together the two older pieces instead, betting that the emotional weight of familiar music would connect more strongly with longtime fans than something entirely new. Given how convincingly futuristic the transporter effect looks, it's easy to assume some kind of early computer animation was involved. It wasn't. The shimmering organic dissolve that accompanied every energized moment was created using nothing more advanced than water, light, and glitter. The effects team filled a glass tank with water and added finely ground metallic particles or confetti to create a swirling, reflective texture. When a scene called for something more dramatic, they dropped in effervescent tablets to generate a stream of rising bubbles. The mixture was then lit with intense lighting against a black backdrop and filmed separately from the actors. In post-production, this glittering footage was layered over shots of performers standing still on the transporter pad, combined with an empty version of the same set to create the illusion of matter dissolving and reforming. The technique stayed in use for years, right up until later series in the franchise finally shifted to fully digital effects. It's rarely discussed in retrospectives, but the show's first season struggled badly, and much of the trouble traced back to one of Roddenberry's own creative rules. He insisted that the crew of the Enterprise could never argue with one another. In his vision of a more evolved humanity, interpersonal conflict simply wouldn't exist among Starfleet officers. The instinct was admirable. The results on screen were often flat. Without tension between characters, episodes tended to feel more like calm committee meetings than dramatic television. Compounding the problem, a Roddenberry associate with no formal writing credentials, had significant unofficial influence over scripts, frequently sending approved drafts back for uncredited rewrites. Turnover among the writing staff was extremely high during the first season as a result. As Roddenberry's health began to decline, producers gradually took over more creative control and started quietly loosening the no-conflict rule. Once genuine tension between characters was allowed back into the scripts, the show's writing noticeably improved, and many longtime fans point to the transition between the first and later seasons as the moment the next generation truly found its identity. Few characters in the franchise are as beloved or as chaotic as the omnipotent trickster Q. What's less well known is that the character exists largely because the pilot episode needed to be longer. The original concept for Encounter at Farpoint centered on a single mystery involving a strange alien station. That story alone didn't provide enough material for the 2-hour premiere the network wanted. To fill the gap, writers added a second storyline, a godlike being who puts humanity itself on trial for its past. That being became Q. The result was a premiere that essentially ran 2 different stories in parallel, with Picard investigating the central mystery while Q periodically reappeared to threaten the crew and pass judgment on the species as a whole. Audiences and critics responded strongly to the character despite, or perhaps because of, his lack of direct involvement in the actual plot. What started as a structural fix to pad out runtime became one of the franchise's most enduring and complex recurring characters, eventually returning to bookend the entire series in its finale. Most actors wait to be cast. Whoopi Goldberg simply called the production and asked. As a child in the 1960s, she had watched the original Star Trek and been deeply affected by seeing a black woman serving as a bridge officer, treated as a full equal among the crew. That image stayed with her for decades. By the late 1980s, Goldberg was an established Hollywood star with an Academy Award nomination to her name. She had no professional need to join a syndicated science fiction show, but she wanted to be part of it anyway. So she reached out to the production directly. Her call was initially dismissed as a prank until LeVar Burton personally vouched for her sincerity. When she finally met with Roddenberry, she made clear she wasn't looking for a big role or a paycheck. She wanted to be part of a legacy that had shaped her own life. Roddenberry created an entirely new character for her, Guinan, a mysterious listener who existed outside the normal chain of command, someone crew members sought out when regulations couldn't help with what they were going through. Goldberg reportedly took a significant pay cut for the role, treating it less like a job and more like a personal thank you to the franchise that had once shown her what was possible. Patrick Stewart didn't expect the next generation to last. As a respected classical stage actor in 1987, taking a lead role in American syndicated science fiction wasn't part of any career plan, and by his own later accounts, he assumed the show would be canceled quickly. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he moved into a small furnished apartment and left much of his belongings packed, anticipating a short stay before returning home to England. Season 1 ended without cancellation. So did Season 2. By the time the show reached its 3rd season, Stewart admitted he had finally stopped bracing for the end. What began as a short-term job turned into 7 seasons for feature films and eventually a return to the role decades later. Stewart has since described The Next Generation as one of the most successful surprises of his career, a role he expected to leave behind quickly and instead helped define for a generation of viewers. The introduction of Lore, Data's identical but far more dangerous counterpart, produced one of the show's most memorable early antagonists. The character very nearly went in a completely different direction. Early drafts of the episode featured a second android designed as a potential romantic interest for Data, intended to explore whether an artificial being could experience love. Brent Spiner reportedly felt the idea played it too safe and pitched an alternative. Instead of a companion, what if the second android was Data's exact double, sharing his appearance, but possessing all the darker emotional impulses Data lacked? Arrogance, resentment, and cruelty? Producers approved the change, and Lore was born. The shift also gave Spiner the rare opportunity to play 2 sharply contrasting characters within the same episode, an early demonstration of his range that the show would return to again and again in future seasons. The Season 5 episode centered on a mysterious time-traveling historian claiming to be from the 26th century, was written with Robin Williams specifically in mind. The character needed someone who could talk circles around the entire bridge crew while staying genuinely unpredictable, and Williams's comedic energy seemed like a perfect fit. Williams reportedly wanted the role, but scheduling made it impossible. He was deep into production on a major feature film at the time, working long, physically demanding days, and with his wife expecting a child, taking on additional work wasn't feasible. With real reluctance, he had to pass. The already completed script needed a replacement quickly, and the role went instead to an actor best known for playing a stuttering, glitch-filled television personality earlier in the decade. The performance he delivered fit the character so well that the episode remains one of the more fondly remembered standalone stories of the series, even though almost nobody watching at the time knew it had been written for someone else entirely. Under showrunner Michael Piller, The Next Generation did something almost unheard of in network television. It opened its script submissions to the general public. Anyone could send in a script, no agent or industry connection required, just a completed manuscript and a signed release form. The response was overwhelming. At its peak, the production reportedly received thousands of unsolicited scripts every year. Piller hired a small team of full-time readers whose entire job was to work through the submissions and provide written feedback, ensuring that properly formatted scripts actually got read rather than discarded. The policy paid off in a major way. One of the show's most critically acclaimed episodes, a time travel story reshaping the Enterprise's history, came directly out of that open submission pile. The open-door script policy continued into the following decade, feeding material into later Star Trek series as well, before eventually being shut down over legal concerns. For more than 10 years, though, the franchise practiced the same openness it so often preached on screen. Between the second and third seasons, Wil Wheaton, who played the young Wesley Crusher, was offered a role in a feature film directed by an acclaimed filmmaker known for prestige dramas. It was the kind of opportunity that could meaningfully shape a young actor's career. The problem was a roughly week-long scheduling overlap with production on The Next Generation. Wheaton asked for flexibility around the specific, conflicting days. The response he received was that his character was essential to an upcoming episode, and the production couldn't proceed without him. Wheaton turned down the film role to stay loyal to the show. Once production resumed, he reportedly discovered